welcome to today's webinar as part of the Center for the Study of Nationalism event series featuring Dr. David Aschheim's recent book, Kreisky, Israel and Jewish Identity. My name is Carsten, Schapkow, Director of the Center for the Study of Nationalism at the University of Oklahoma, and I will be your host today. Before we begin, I would like to thank the College of International Studies and the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies for their support of this event, and to Stephanie Hohmann-Sager and to Trice Heimann for their technical support. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Aschheim to you. Dr. Aschheim is the author of Kreisky, Israel and Jewish Identity, published with the University of New Orleans Press in 2022. Dr. Aschheim currently serves as Deputy Consul General at the Consulate General of Israel to the Midwest. He was appointed to this Chicago-based post in 2020 when he assumed the role as Counsel for Diplomatic Diplomacy, serving as the spokesperson for the consulate's 9-state Midwestern region. Dr. Aschheim comes to Chicago from West Africa, where he served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the Israeli Embassy in Dakar, Senegal. As Deputy Consul General, Dr. Aschheim's portfolio includes overseeing economic, culture, media, press, academic, interfaith, and community outreach initiatives. Before becoming a diplomat, Dr. Aschheim, a Jerusalem native, worked as a director and advisor in the public and NGO sectors and was a senior trainer in the business, public, and education sectors. He holds a Ph.D. from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His book, Kreisky, Israel and Jewish Identity, revolves around one of the most controversial political leaders since World War II, the first and only Jewish leader of Austria, Bruno Kreisky. Let me introduce Bruno Kreisky briefly to you. According to the Encyclopedia Judaica, Bruno Kreisky was born in 1911 in Vienna as the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer. His family was Jewish, yet Kreisky's relation to his Jewish identity was complex and ambivalent during his lifetime. He joined the Socialist Workers' Youth Association at the age of 15 and became head of its education department. After the fascist seizure of power in 1934, Kreisky was active in the clandestine Socialist Party and was arrested in 1935. He spent nearly 2 years in prison, and after the Nazi Anschluss in 1938, he immigrated to Sweden. Kreisky returned to Austria in 1946 and joined the diplomatic service. He was personal assistant to the Socialist President of Austria, Theodor Körner, and in 1953 became Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs in the coalition government of the People's Party and Socialist Party. He participated in the negotiations with the Soviet Union, which led to the Austrian Treaty of 1955, and from 1959 to 1966 was Foreign Minister of Austria. Following the socialist defeat in the 1966 elections, Kreisky was made leader of the Socialist Party. He succeeded in creating a new image for the party by the formulation of new economic, social, and cultural policies. With the socialist victory in the general elections of 1970, with a relative majority, he became Chancellor of Austria. In 1971, after early elections, the Socialist Party achieved an absolute majority. In 1975 and 1979, these victories were repeated. After the next elections in 1983, when the party failed to get a majority, Kreisky resigned as Chancellor and as head of the Socialist Party. During his lifetime, Kreisky saw himself as an Austrian first. In the international arena, Kreisky tried to establish Austria, despite many of her citizens' active role during the Holocaust, as an intermediary that remained neutral but opted for a peace-seeking role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As a matter of fact, Kreisky rejected Zionism. Kreisky's tense relationship to Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir is insightful, in particular in this regard. A year before his death in 1990, Kreisky, in an interview with photographer and author Herlinde Kölbel, said, quote, Kreisky, "I do not feel responsible just because I'm Jewish for what happened in Israel. I feel responsible as I'm representing human rights. My Jewishness is a completely separate thing. It is a private matter." In his book, Kreisky, Israel and Jewish Identity, Daniel Aschheim has drawn on all past research, and he interviewed former ambassadors and examined the archived correspondence between the Israeli embassy in Vienna and the foreign ministry in Jerusalem. In his book, he does focus on Kreisky's Jewishness in historical context, Kreisky and the Austrian victims theory, on political scandals such as the Kreisky-Peter affair and the Waldheim affair, and on Kreisky and the 1973 Machek incident, and finally on Kreisky, Zionism, Israel, and the Palestinian Arab world. The students in this class, German Jewish History After the Holocaust, formulated a few questions Dr. Aschheim had agreed to answer before we are opening the discussion for all participants of this webinar. And so the first questions that had been raised among the students is for you, Dr. Aschheim. What makes the post-Holocaust situation in Austria unique compared to Germany?
Thank you very much, Dr. Schapkow, and thank you for joining this class. So to answer the question of what makes the unique story of Austria, indeed, this is a unique story, because when we are looking at the history of post-World So the Nazis, and then post-World War II, the reconciliation efforts and the West coming into Germany and Germany being split to different parts, and then a beginning of a transition that was led by Western forces, the denazification process, and the Germans themselves trying to reflect at their responsibility to the horrors that took place under their hands by them. Now, this is the German case. In the German case, many people research, many people discuss, many people know about how they reconciliated with their past, and until today, they're still going on, and reparations and conversations, and there are different conversations on whether it was all genuine or whether it was pushed by the Americans, not to their will, but that's a different story. The Austrian story, on the other hand, is something else that we're experiencing completely. What are we seeing here? We're seeing a country that is post-World War II, does not acknowledge its responsibility for what has been happening under their territory and with their forces joining Nazi forces. So it's kind of remaking history. So when we are seeing the reality of history, is that the Germans came into Austria, they were accepted very nicely in a lot of hospitality, as the Austrians saw the Germans as part of them. And Austria, until the very late 1980s, saw itself not only as someone who was neutral, but they saw themselves as the first victims of the Nazis. So they considered themselves to be occupied by the Nazis against their will, and the horrific things that took place, they did it to them. So they were like Poland, like the Jews, so maybe not exactly, but they were definitely seen as victims. And this victims doctrine, Austria seeing itself as the first victims of National Socialism, went on through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, despite Austria being a neutral country in the Cold War in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. We are talking about an approach that was really part of the Austrian identity. So not only top down, but down up, top down, middle, all parts of who Austria was. And in the middle, we have an Austrian Jewish chancellor who lost more than 20 of his relatives were murdered in the Holocaust. And he himself, with his immediate family, had the privilege to be in exile in Sweden during those days. And this exile in Sweden is what shaped his career and shaped his personality and shaped his future, as he himself, as a Jewish chancellor, you would expect him to come back to Austria after. If he came back, you would expect him to have resentment to those who murdered his family, or at least to be critical towards the policies vis-a-vis the Jewish community or vis-a-vis their past. And not only did he not do that, he saw this kind of these few horrific years as another part of history. So horrible things took place by the Nazis. The Austrians he also saw as victims. He saw himself as he was even in prison in the Dollfuss dictatorship. Dollfuss dictatorship is not very well known. It was a very short period of time of a dictatorship in Austria before the Nazis came. And he saw himself when he was sitting in jail, because he was a true firm socialist. He was sitting in the jail cell, in the cell with a few Nazis. And he is a socialist activist with Nazis sitting against the dictatorship. And this experience for him, when he saw a good, so-called good Nazi there, who he became a friend of his, throughout his political career, he remembered that occasion, and then he distinguished between the good Nazis and the bad Nazis. And for him, this was a bad episode of history. He went to Sweden, came back to Austria, came back directly to his career as an Austrian diplomat, continued to grow and grow and grow, became Austrian foreign minister and chancellor. And all of his career those days, not only did he support it, he actually brought in former Nazi ministers into his cabinet, and he supported them against criticism. He said, "What do you want to do? They did what they did. Let's go on. We can't continue to dwell in the past." And this is a huge difference between the two countries, Germany and Austria. And Austria only changed in the end of the 1980s with the Kurt-Waldheim affair, where Kurt Waldheim, whoever doesn't know, was the Chancellor of Austria, but he was also elected as the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he had lied on his past, and it was published that he was an SS officer in his past. And then this was the change in Austrian society that took place only in the 90s towards understanding their responsibility of their Nazi past. And also here, Kreisky himself, not only when he was not a chancellor anymore, but he also supported Waldheim also in so-called garbage time, which brings a lot of question marks about Kreisky's behavior towards this victim's doctrine of Austria.
Mm-hmm. So you already addressed to some extent the Austrian victim theory. So he lost 21 members during the Holocaust. At another point in your book, you even described Kreisky as a pre-Holocaust Jew. And I think let's go just over to the other really interesting part of the book, this kind of a clash between Golda Meir and Bruno Kreisky, which is very complex, but apparently they didn't get along very well at all. And at some point, there's even the discussion that we come from different worlds. I mean, there's nothing that brings us together anyhow. However, she later, Golda Meir said, well, maybe I was a little bit too harsh on him because a peculiar situation in Austria with increasing Arab nationalism was something he saw and we didn't necessarily see at this point. So he was a little bit milder at the end. Can you talk a little bit more about these really two complex Jewish personalities?
Yes, it's a great question. And because I don't know how many people here read the book, so I'm going to try and refer as if they didn't read the book. So this is a very interesting thing. What we are seeing here are two very, very prominent Jewish leaders. Both of them, not only Jewish leaders, but very prominent socialist leaders who are part of the international socialist movement, which today seems like prehistorical things, but then it was the most important international movement, the Socialist International, which makes it a even more interesting thing also for the gossip, but not only for the gossip, but mostly also for policy. And Golda Meir was the first woman elected and the only one, Prime Minister of Israel. She was the head of the Labour Party. Kreisky was the Jewish Chancellor of Austria. And the two this couldn't stand each other. They could not stand each other on the personal level. They could not stand each other on the ideological level. They could not see each other, how each one sees the world completely differently. I'll give you an example. So Kreisky saw himself first as an Austrian national patriot, part of the Habsburg Empire continuation. His family came from that tradition, intellectual Austrian tradition, of course, from Jewish acculturated background. So not assimilated, he uses acculturated, which is a different term. He sees himself part of this broad, big Austrian history and happens to be from Jewish heritage or Jewish origin. Golda Meir, as the Prime Minister of Israel, sees herself first and foremost a Jew, an Israeli, and a woman leader of this country. And these conversations about identity and importance are not only a matter of the past. These are conversations we're dealing, me on my other hat as an Israeli diplomat, on a daily level. So on identity, what are you first? Am I here in America? Am I American Jew? Am I Jew-American? What is my connection to Israel? Who am I? What is my responsibility as a proud American for many generations? Why do us Israelis view you Jews as also part of our broader community? And these are conversations that are going on and on and on. I'm not sure how much you hear them in Oklahoma, but we hear them a lot in Chicago. We hear them a lot on the East Coast and the West Coast between the different communities. And this brings the clash between the two, but it's not only, one needs to say, it's not only Golda Meir and Kreisky. Kreisky had these relationships with all the leaders of Israel then who were on the left, seemingly the same on the ideology, but they were not. So he called Begin, Menachem Begin, a petty Jew from Eastern Europe. And Begin called him a self-hating Jew. And it became very emotional. And it always became a matter of, it was not only so, I know, Carsten, you also in the German history, Jewish history kind of background. So here, Kreisky was really reflecting this Ostjude, Westjude, the clash between the Jews coming from the West Europe and opposed to East Europe. And he saw Golda Meir and Menachem Begin as Ostjuden, as Jews coming from a not the same level like him. And he used to say, what do I have in common with these Jews from Yemen or other places around the world? I'm an Austrian. And in this very complicated relationship, it came into a climax in a specific event, which I don't know if you want me to talk about now, because it's very much related to the Golda Meir and Kreisky. So one needs to understand the time period. Now, in the 1970s, Austria was still, I mean, it's a small country, not very significant in the world. It was an important, relatively important country in Central Europe. But Kreisky brought it to world attention by expanding the real significance of Austria by being involved in many places around the world, one of them being the Middle East. The Middle East before Kreisky was a place that was not important, not relevant for Austrians. And he was the first European leader to talk about the two-state solution between Israelis and Palestinians, the first leader to acknowledge the PLO as the official representation of the Palestinian people. He was speaking to Yasser Arafat, and he brought legitimization for these conversations that were then considered radical left and not part of the mainstream, not in Europe, not in America, and definitely not in Israel. And this involvement brought a lot of criticism. He was definitely the most hated person in Israel, and still is today one of the most loved people in Austria. And when I speak to people in my parents' generation, I've never heard his name before. And that's what made me write this book, because I said, how can that be that a Jew who was elected 3 times in anti-Semitic Austria was running the show and leading the efforts to a two-state solution? And he's not even mentioned in Wikipedia English today as part of this history. So he's a forgotten person in the Jewish kind of collective history, and definitely in the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts history. And his involvement brought a lot of anger, but also brought, on the one hand, he was very critical towards Israel. He really called Israel a crusader state. He compared Israelis to the Nazis. He was really, really harsh. And he said, like you mentioned before, that he's not a Zionist. But on the other hand, a lot of his actions were, on the contrary, were to promote Zionist activities. So he was the only leader to accept the fact that there will be a transit camp of Soviet Jews who were allowed to, after a long campaign, to leave the Soviet Union, to come to Israel and make aliyah, as we call it, to immigrate to Israel. And this camp was led by the Jewish Agency for Israel. He didn't like that fact. He had a lot of conspiracy theories saying that the Mossad is there and that's a place where they do things, but it operated there. And tens of thousands of Jewish immigrants, Soviet immigrants, came through Austria on their way to Israel. And that was not liked by Palestinian and Arab terrorists. And they saw Kreisky responsible for that, despite him being very, very positive towards the Arab world and that. And in September 1973, end of September, a train leaving the Czech border towards Austria with Jewish immigrants is attacked by 3 Palestinian Syrian-based terrorists, and they hijack the train and are claiming a few things. They are saying to Kreisky, A, Israel needs to release Palestinian terrorists from their prisons in Israel. B, we will need to be released and get free, the terrorists. And 3, you need to close down the Schönau terrorist camp, the Schönau transit camp. Now, I'm in brackets, there are also conversations, the book I'm writing about that. It's not clear whether this closure of the camp was actually proposed by Kreisky to the Arab ambassadors there to tell the terrorists because he didn't like the camp, or the terrorists themselves ordered it. Let's assume it's the terrorists asking that. Kreisky, this happens a year after the massacre of the Israeli athletes in Munich in the Olympic Games. A lot of trauma by the German way of handling it, mishandling, people murdered, terrorists leaving, not a good way. And Kreisky says, I'm doing everything in my capacity to keep people alive. And this is what I care about. So they can close the camp, let the terrorists go, release the prisoners, no one will get hurt. And the Israeli prisoners, the prisoners in Israel are not connected to me, so I don't have anything to do. So he decides to close the Schönau camp. This is actually the first time in world history of terror or modern terrorism that a Western leader gives in to terrorist demands. So this brought a lot of criticism from America, from the West, and especially from Israel. Golda Meir was furious. She was speaking in the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. Immediately she summons herself into Kreisky's office. In Kreisky's office, she sits onto a very, very harsh conversation. And after an hour of conversation, she leaves the room. The Israeli press is all standing outside there. And she's asked, how is the meeting? And she summarizes it in one sentence only. And this is, until today, the sentence that everyone who remembers Kreisky remembers in Israel. And I quote, all the headlines in Israeli papers say, even a glass of water, he didn't offer me. Now, this claim says a lot to it because it reflects something she wanted to say. Now, I'll just say that I interviewed in my book many people who knew him very closely, but the woman who told me, Margit Schmidt, she was his personal assistant for 30 years. She told me until the end of his life, he never forgave Golda Meir for this sentence because not only did they host her and ask her if she wants to have a shower, she baked the cake for the meeting. So maybe water they didn't give, but coffee and cake they did. So it just shows you fake news is not a new thing today. It happened also before. But this just shows the hatred and the disputing each other. And I'll end by saying this. There's a line that say that people quote in a few days after the Yom Kippur War broke, we had also another kind of conversation between now an American leader. So we had the Secretary of State of America, who was also Jewish, and Golda Meir. So you all know who I'm talking about? Yeah. Okay. So yes, so I think he's still alive today. Right? Is he still alive? I think he's now in his 90s.
Yes, I think so.
Yes, okay. So when they were speaking to him, so Golda Meir, when she spoke to Kissinger, so she asked Kissinger, you need to send us weapons to protect our country. We are losing this war. If you don't send weapons, it's the end. And she was so angry at him. And he told her, Golda, listen to me. First, I'm an American. Second, I'm the Secretary of State of the United States. And third, I'm Jewish. And she tells him, don't worry, it's okay. In Hebrew, we read from right to left. So, and this is not only a joke, this is part of really the understanding and the difference and the clash between these groups. And it's the same with Kreisky. So with Kissinger or with Kreisky, it was really a deep understanding, different understanding of what comes first. And Golda Meir could not grasp the fact that a Jew would not care first and foremost about his Jewish brothers and sisters. And Kreisky and Kissinger could not bear the fact that she doesn't understand that they're first Americans or Austrians.
I mean, this is really fascinating, and it comes across so nicely in your book. because you have all these first-hand accounts based on the many interviews you conducted. And so that's really this fresh perspective on this ambivalent man. I mean, during a time, many people do not remember what he did in terms of his understanding of making Austria, in a way, independent and disconnected from the past. I mean, my students were sometimes very surprised that he had many Jewish friends. He was connected to the Jewish community, but in the outside world, I think for us today, it's maybe a little bit more normal. I don't know. But back then it was really difficult in a way. And then, as you said, that he was voted into office 3 times with his absolute majority. It's just unbelievable. But before I continue with maybe own questions, I would like to ask our other participants online. Please write in the chat if you have any questions for Dr. Aschheim. And before I'm answering or giving the first question to you, there's also this little anecdote about Bruno Kreisky's brother, who lived in Israel after an accident he had as a child. And you only talked about 2 or 3 pages about that. I mean, how did you find about that real scenario that the brother was living in Israel?
It's actually a hilarious story. I don't know, sad, funny or not, but I was sitting with my parents. So my parents are in there. My father's 81, my mother is in her 70s. So they remember the days, and they remember it was all over the news. So Kreisky was the person that was all over the place. And I asked them about it, and then they said, yes, you know, there used to be Paul Kreisky. He was very famous. I said, what famous? What did he do? I was sure he's maybe a prominent professor, a prominent, intellectual like Kreisky, maybe politician. He said, no. He was a known beggar in the streets of downtown Jerusalem. And I looked and I said, what do you mean? He said, yes, it was also used to be in the gossip of the newspapers in Israel. I said, I have to see more about that. And I read and read and read, and it was not easy to find. And in the end, when I found out, happened to be that his brother had an accident. Some say probably fell from a tree when he was younger. And because of this accident, he became a bit mentally disabled, but he also had a child. And his child, the nephew of Bruno Kreisky, served in the Israeli army. And this is another dissonance that we see, that Kreisky on the one hand said the Israeli army is like crusaders and like the Nazis, they're horrible. And on the other hand, every place they recall that Kreisky himself was so proud of his nephew being in the Israeli army. So again, a dissonance that is very hard to understand. So what the newspapers said all the time were that Kreisky is like he abandoned Israel, he's abandoning his brother, his poor brother in Israel, not caring about him, not caring. So I said, I have to find out something about the story. I can't get anything. Nothing is in the press. And it sounds very peculiar. And I got to the person who was Kreisky's lawyer in Israel that was responsible for the transaction between him and Paul Kreisky's brother. And I had a long interview. He's a very prominent Israeli lawyer. He's the husband of the former Supreme Court director of the Chief Supreme Court Justice in Israel. And he told me he was in constant contact with Kreisky, who sent money transfers, wire transfers weekly to his brother. He cared deeply about it. He used to phone him a few times a week to ask how is his brother doing, and he cared so deeply about it. So again, we see dissonance. On the one hand, it looks like he doesn't care about Israel. On the other hand, he does many things that are for the future, the way he sees it, for the future of Israel. On the one hand, says, I'm against Zionism. I don't see why the Jews should have their homeland or there's any connection between Jews. And on the other hand, what he does is care about the Jewish state. And how do I see it? Because Menachem Begin from the right, he says it also when his secretary of Begin is interviewed, he said, Begin knew when he has a serious problem, the man he calls is Bruno Kreisky. And he calls Kreisky for a prisoner exchange between Israelis and Palestinians and Lebanon. And it was a very problematic deal for the Israelis. A lot of prisoners terrorists were released, and then Begin blamed Kreisky for that, even though he asked for him to mitigate it. So always a conversation back and forth, very challenging. But his personal relationship with his brother showed, as you mentioned before, Carsten, before you said, Kreisky on the one hand seems to said in his bio, in every interview, says, my Jewishness is not relevant to anything I do. I happen to be from a background. But then when I interview people who knew him, they say his sense of humor was Jewish, his friends were Jewish, his wife was Jewish, his closest allies were Jewish, his cultural references were Jewish. So it's always very hard to grasp this dissonance between what he called himself and what he was in reality. And I don't think it was a show. I think he was really in a conflict of identity. And I want to quote, let me see if I can find it, but it is something I always find very interesting to see, that he was very, really intellectual in whatever he was. And when he was portrayed by Israeli ambassadors who met him, they say he was very knowledgeable, very nice, very talking. And when it came to things connected to Israel or Jewishness, it really became insane. And I want to quote to you here, this is here in front of me. So, one day after I'm quoting from page 82, one day after the described meeting between Ambassador Scheck and Ambassador Nestor, the Austrian, Chancellor Kreisky unexpectedly phoned the Israeli ambassador in Austria, Dagan. Dagan reports this call in a highly classified telegram, which I opened in the archives, addressed directly to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Yigal Allon, and Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Kreisky's reaction is depicted in a very critical manner by the Israeli ambassador, and I'm quoting. Kreisky phoned me while I was at home, and for 20 minutes, he erupted in a way that could not be described other than on the edge of insanity. Dagan portrays Kreisky's method of communication as an unstopped flow of attacks and slanders. And again, in another place, he's considered to be, people are saying that one needs to check Kreisky in a psychological manner and less as an historian or a social scientist. And I'm not one of them, but definitely one can see things that are not rational when it comes to the Jewish or Israeli power.
Let's think a minute about the situation in Sweden. So Kreisky is in Sweden, Willy Brandt is in Sweden, who will later become Chancellor of Germany. When
Right.
Brandt is coming back, he was always seen as a traitor. Germans said, you left Germany when you could have defended her or something like that. So there was this completely misconception that he was abroad fighting for a better Germany to come after Hitler's defeat. And he went through these years, and the two men, Kreisky and Brandt, were friends, colleagues in a way. And so one of my students wrote here to me in the chat, how could Kreisky handle that, differentiate between the good and the bad Nazis when he came back in 1946? Did there anything come across in your conversations that he was maybe more mad with the Nazis than he actually confessed to be?
This is a question I get often, and I don't have an easy solution to this question, because I think it's a combination between realpolitik. He was a very good politician, and he was also at times populist. So he was a big intellectual, but also populist. And because of that, he knew, and this is the grim reality, but it was the reality. If you want to be elected in an anti-Semitic Austria, and one needs to remember, we are not talking about 50 years, 100, second, third generation. We are talking about 1970s. The people who live there are still the Nazis, not former, not people who are descendants of. These are people who were first-hand Nazis, who live in Carinthia and other areas which are dominated by Nazi members. And in order to win their votes, one needs to show that they are with them, they understand them. That's the political aspect. On the other hand, he never, of course, said good things about the Nazis. He understood, he said it was horrific things. However, he said one needs to say, what do you want to do from here? I also think that he really had what I said about the jail aspect. He really believed, I think so, I can't know what's in his mind, but I do believe that for him, he was a big Austrian, successful Austrian. He was already successful before the Nazis came to power. He was already in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a diplomat. The Nazis came, horrible episode, went to Sweden, came back, and life was weitergehen. So life goes on. And for him, it was, he asked, so what do you want me to do? Should we put all of them in jail? Should we throw them all to, and this is also, one needs to be a bit fair here and say, look, we all think about the Germans. So what happened in Germany? So Germany, in the end, in the Nuremberg trials, so the biggest Nazis were hung. The big Nazis got a bit of jail. The medium, small, and just supporters continued with their life. And one needs to also look, even the United States, they're built in order to fight the Cold War. They brought Nazi scientists who built a lot of the important things in their future. In America, it's not a thing that's talked about a lot, but it's history. And saying, what do you want to do? Do we put all in jail? Do we want to put them all? There's no country, no future. So I think for him, it was really a combination of all. Realpolitik, the understanding that what can you do? It was a bad period, we need to go on. And three, not seeing it such as a significant event in Austrian history, even though it was, but he didn't see it as is. And I'll just say another thing. I think he also had an issue with which can be explained also when he didn't need to be so proactively supporting of that, he was still doing it, like with the Waldheim case. And that doesn't make sense. No one understands Wiesenthal issue and Waldheim, why it was so intensive, very hard to explain. I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah. So there's another question from my colleague here, Hadas Cohen. I read it out. Do you think that his attitude towards Israel stemmed from survivor's guilt, from ambition to become a politician, or possibly from the preference of his Austrian identity over any other one, similarly to Hannah Arendt's?
Great question, and I think it really brings back to the same answer I just gave now. I think it really is a combination between the three. Realpolitik showing, look how I'm even criticizing Israel. No other European leader could criticize Israel as much. Sorry, my daughter is here. I needed to bring her to work, so she's sitting in the back. So when we are talking about Israel, we are talking about being very critical towards Israeli policies and very, very critical towards all of that. And then again, one asks yourself, how could he as a Jew say that? But I think it's on the contrary. He is saying to the Austrian people, look, I can tell these people whatever no one else can say because I'm Jewish. Without saying that, he said that. And this we see quite often in these cases. It's like a kosher certificate for showing, look, I'm strong and I don't care what they say. Look what I can do. I don't see a regular Austrian coming in power and saying, being so critical about Israel because he would be attacked as an anti-Semite immediately. So he could not do that. So I think also he really, part of his ideology, he didn't see eye to eye Israeli policy. I think he did care about the future of the state of Israel, and he saw the fact that Israel goes that way as the wrong way. And four, I think he was also looking to be a world leader, and for him, this was becoming a world leader. Being present, getting active there, and finding that, and said, me as a Jew, I have the moral responsibility and moral sense, and yet again, but very problematic. There are a lot of things that don't work together. On the one hand, being not Zionist, on the other hand, being pro-Zionist, a lot of different things that are hard to connect.
So can you hear me still?
Yes.
Okay, there's another question from my colleague Alison Gonzalez.
Wait, I see. I think we missed Caleb Faris here. There's another question before. And Jason.
Okay, can you read it? It's from Caleb? Caleb?
Yes. Should I read? I'll read it. So self-conscious Jewishness seems to be a through point in much scholarship on Jewish diasporas. Do we think distant Austrian nationalism distinctly informed Kreisky of his role within the Republic? What was his opinions on the militant Austrian nationalists that actively fought the Anschluss? Interestingly, when I worked in Austria, Kreisky was only ever mentioned as Jewish in passing. The same goes for many famous Jewish Austrians. Great question. So I will say, I'll start by the second part. Yes, you're right. Many people, when I speak to Austrians, I actually went, and I'm sad we're doing this virtually because the questions here are great, the best I've got until now, and I'm going all over the country physically to present it. So maybe next time I'll come physically and we'll have a larger conversation. But every time I meet Austrians who were there those days, they say, we didn't even know he's Jewish. They didn't. It was not an issue. It was much more an issue in Israel than it was in Austria. But again, it's part of that. So probably if he would not be so active about it, maybe it would have, if he would have been pro-Israel and pro that, maybe they would say, oh, because he's Jewish. So that also comes to a part. And it was mentioned once in one of the election campaigns of the Austrian People's Party against him. The candidate who ran against him, his slogan was, ein echter Österreicher, a real Austrian, saying that someone else is not a real Austrian. And why? Not because of his hair color, but because he's Jewish. He didn't say it, but it was obvious. And Professor Ruth Wodak has a very interesting books about exactly the terminology, anti-Semitic terminology used in Austria to describe the Jews without saying Jews. So forever. So instead of saying the Jews, you say the East Coast. So, you know, the money, a lot of different anti-Semitic quotes that are based on that. So about his nationalists. So on the one hand, he was a true national Austrian nationalist. On the other hand, he was a universalist, part of the Habsburg, like the intellectual spirit. And that also is a contradiction, because if you are really a person of the world, you shouldn't be such a nationalist yourself. And such an Austrian, you can be patriotic, but he was really a nationalist Austrian. And another thing that is also a contradiction, which is always, I find pretty interesting. And so he was against nationalism in this concept, but yes, I don't have an answer what he thought about the military nationalists in Austria. He was against it in general. But again, another contradiction, when he spoke, he had a very close relationship with the biggest dictators who murdered their people in the Arab world, whether Gaddafi or Assad the father or Sadat, others. And yet when he describes them in his memoir, he sits and describes them and he says, beautiful thing. I sat and we spoke about classical music and we both like the same operas. And you see it, you think you're sitting with Sigmund Freud in the room, not with a mass murderer. And yet when he comes and speaks again about Golda and about Begin, so this petty Jew, this horrible person, this, you know, these terminologies that are not used against. So on the one hand, he says X, on the other one, he says this. He had a lot of the Western glorification of the Orient, of how beautiful the Arab world is. And again, the Western world, the Jewish world is not in the standards of the West as he expected. And the funny anecdote that I write in my book, I find it completely hilarious, is that in one of the interviews I had was with Uri Avneri. Uri Avneri was one of the most radical left-wing leaders in Israel. He was a writer, was a political activist. He was the first to meet Yasser Arafat in Tunisia when it was illegal. He introduced Yasser Arafat to Kreisky, and he was considered always to be by the mainstream Israeli as one of the most naive people, very dignified, but very, very naive. I had the privilege of interviewing him in his house in Tel Aviv in his 92nd birthday. I think it was that day. And he passed away about a year or two ago. And I asked him about Kreisky, and he told me, you know, when I asked him about his view of the Arab world, he said to me, you know, Kreisky was very naive. I said, you're telling me about someone else that he is naive? Then he must be ultra, ultra naive. If Uri Avneri, who's considered by everyone the most naive politician, is telling me that Kreisky is naive, then what else can we say? So for me, that's the best answer we got.
Yeah, thank you, Caleb. Great question and also wonderful answer. I mean, the last question, maybe speaking against from the chat on Austria right now, is from Alison Gonzalez, who is residing in Vienna half of the year. So I read it out. Thinking about legacies of anti-Semitism in Austria, I'm often struck by the noticeable prevalence of statues representing the anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger. As you undoubtedly know, the home of Hitler's birthplace in Braunau is also still very much standing, and in fact is being seriously considered as a future police station, as though to lay the groundwork for future, if not already present, Nazi pilgrimages. Here's my question. Do you think these still standing symbols of anti-Semitism are in any way a part of or maybe attributed to Kreisky's legacy? Were these things known or discussed during Kreisky's leadership?
So it's also a good question. I don't think it was connected. During those days, there was no discussion at all. It was clear that they'll stay. It's like we're looking in America today in London, in England, about statues of former colonialists or former racists. Do we take down the statue or not? They founded the university, but today they are considered bad. These conversations were not in the world those days at all. It was not the trend to discuss them. And still today, Dr. Karl Lueger Ring is one of the big streets in Vienna, one of the main streets you go, the Ring. And he was one of the reasons Hitler listened to Dr. Lueger's speeches and got inspiration from them. That's a fact. So, and he's still there. Nevertheless, Austria today is in a completely different place. Israel and Austrian relations have never been so good as they are the last 5 to 10 years. And Austria is dealing with its past, is looking back. Sebastian Kurz, former chancellor, came and gave tribute and said officially, saying we are sorry for what had happened, taken responsibility. We are not talking the same era today, even though not all Austrians had the same length of process like the Germans did, like we said in the past. Therefore, there are things, I still don't think there's a lot of debate in Austrian society about taking away these statues. It's raised, but not enough, I think.
Yeah, wonderful questions. Great answer. So I think I'm looking at the watch. I mean, due to my, technically incapability of handling it well at the beginning, I think there are 2 more questions from my students here. If we can just try to answer those. So is that from you, Ariana? Do you think that Kreisky's distancing his Jewish identity away from his career was a form of protection from his own internalized issues, or do you think he felt it would further his cause for Austria?
I think it's the first, and I think it had something to do with him. He was not sure what he wants to do with that. He was just not certain. What do I want to go? Where do I want to go? Am I only in Austria? I think he didn't want to talk about it at all. I think it was something he wanted to put aside, but it was always brought to him by the Israeli leaders on the one hand, who reminded him, the Jewish community who reminded him, and also he wanted not to be involved, but then he put himself so involved in the Middle East, then he should have known that he'll get into that. So I think, again, a contradiction. If you don't want to be involved, then don't. If you do want to involve, there'll be a price to it. And don't blame the others for calling you part of that. It's part of the game. So I think he really lived between 2 different lives, and you can see it in a place in the book. I also quote Barbara Taufer, who sat with him in his deathbed and said he cried and cried and cried in the end, saying the Austrians did not change. Saying, what does it mean about the anti-Semitism? And B, he cried about the fact that he could not visit Israel in his last years, not as chancellor, because of demonstrations against him. And he didn't understand that, and he really cared. So it shows you it really was in him. It was definitely part of who he was. If this is, they say usually people in their deathbeds show the most realistic aspect of their personality.
Okay, thank you. So the last question is from Caden Donovan, and he asked, how has Kreisky's legacy influenced Austrian politics and society in the years since his tenure as chancellor and after his death?
Great question. So there are those, some saying there's a joke, some say there's a bad joke, but say that he is still, until today, the most loved person in Austria since Hitler. But I'm not going to quote that, because that someone told me in Austria, one of the Jewish community leaders, but he's today seen as the most important Austrian leader in post-World War II, for sure. So he brought them to the map, he brought them to central attention, but mostly impacted internal matters in the matter of socialism, of bringing innovative ideas of socialism into society. So he really brought this part of socialism, and no one else in the Socialist Party has ever been so innovative such as himself. And since then, the Socialist Party, the left, barely wins in Austria. So this is who is remembered. His legacy is there, and his legacy is also seen by the Kreisky Forum and others as a legacy of promoting his values in the international arena, usually very critical of Israel and usually very pro-Arab. So that's usually those who see it in the diplomatic era, that's the Kreisky legacy.
Okay, very good. And I see here a comment from a man called Vincent Klaus. I read it out, just a note. Karl Lueger Ring was renamed to Universitätsring in 2012. So there's a certain level of awareness for this problematic naming. However, there's still a Karl Lueger Platz in Vienna. So thank you, Mr. Klaus.
Thank you for
And
that.
because we are running out of time, thank you very much, Daniel Aschheim, for spending some time with us talking about your really fascinating book. I highly recommend buying it and reading it. Here's a copy for all of you to take a look at. I think what we found out during this conversation is very enlightening and hopefully will keep us going thinking about this highly interesting figure in the 20th century Austrian politics. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for your brilliant question. And I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you and a happy Easter, happy Passover, whatever you say.
Yeah, same to you. I mean, it was really fun.
Thank you. Vielen Dank.
Okay. Vielen Dank, Daniel. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.